Hello and good morning to everyone on the East Coast. My name is Aubrey Hruby and it's my honor and pleasure to moderate this panel today on global trade and manufacturing and the trends that have shaped it in the last couple of years, particularly this year, 2020. As everyone knows and all of our viewers know, it's been an eventful year. We are living through some of the greatest disruption to global trade ever. And it's been a shared experience, whether you're in Beijing or Kinshasa, whether you're in Vietnam or in Brazil. There's been a massive disruption in global movement of goods, people, and capital. And so it's really an honor today to have this conversation, to break it down a little bit. Where are the exaggerated risks? Where are the real risks? And what are experts seeing when it comes to international trade? I want to say that all our viewers know our esteemed panels and can access their bios, so please do so. We won't spend a lot of time on that, but really we want to jump into the meatiest issues here. For the last couple of years, U.S. China trade tensions have been all over the headlines. We know there have been tough talks, there have been concessions made, and challenges present themselves still. And so we want to dig into this question of what is the state of U.S. China trade relations pre-COVID, during COVID, and looking forward. And I want to start by reaching out to an expert on the topic. He's written 70 books. He's absolutely prolific. So Dr. Wang, can you please give us your views from where you sit, particularly in Beijing, on the state of U.S. China trade? You seem to be on mute.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay, thank you, Aubrey, and really a great honor to be on this panel with so many distinguished panelists tonight, and also good morning for all of you probably. I think it's really great that we can have this communication dialogue. I think that the topic you're talking is really very relevant for our contemporary time. I mean, this year is 75 years after the Second World War, and now we're fighting another war which is confronting the human beings, the virus from the nature. So we are really facing a lot of time. But I think that China-U.S. relations, for the last several years, we see a steadily deterioration, which I think is very unfortunate. I think U.S. has actually, when it's established diplomatic ties with China in 1979, that's where exactly China basically opened up to the West. And since then, I think the great changes has taken place in China, and China has really benefited with these exchanges with U.S. And the U.S. is really, I think, that helped China for many ways as well. I mean, that we can see a lot of U.S. companies come to China. We can see that China has been able to also, lift in so many people out of poverty, 800 million actually. Cutting 70% of world trade, world poverty level. And also, there's about 70,000 U.S. companies doing business in China, generating 700 billion revenues in China. Many U.S. companies now doing business in China, very significant, like, I'm sure that the largest market, largest company in the world, Apple, they had a 20-25% business in China, largest market overseas.
And how are those trends changing because of the tensions? We know that many American companies have looked to China as a large market over the last 2 decades and really worked hard to build their market share in China and learn lessons from doing business there. But how is this newfound realignment changing those trends?
I think there could be several reasons for that. One is that my great friend, former colleague at the Harvard Kennedy School, Graham Allison, has said this. He hit this trap. I mean, a rising power probably catching up with existing power. There's some structural probably conflict or problem too. There could be some explanation of that. Second, I think that also China has a different system that probably suitable for China, but that may not be as at the expectation of our U.S. colleague that they were thinking China could converge rather than diverge. So that's another thing. Thirdly, I think that there's a lot of cultural difference too. That China is Oriental culture. Like I just attended U.S. Ambassador Terry Branstad's farewell reception, and he's saying that Chinese people are really hardworking, attached greatly to the family values, and attached greatly to education. So there are some attributes to China's success today. I think he's quite summarized well. But I think the really thing is that we are really there's a disappearing of the trust. I think that's really fundamental, and also the communication. I think also on the China part probably not doing well. I mean, in terms of communicate. So I think we have many things to examine. I mean, from both sides. I mean, can't be just one side, of course.
Yeah, and where you sit is an important bridge between the cultures, between the markets, and so we really appreciate that. Fred, I would like to bring you in. You were chairman of the U.S. Export-Import Bank, the longest serving one, and want to get your perspective on what this period has looked like for mainly American companies and the U.S. institutions that stand there to help them commercially abroad. You're also on mute.
There we go. Thank you. Sorry about that. And Congressman Hill, good to see you. You and I met through Larry Walter when your first day in office. I remember that. I think one of the things that often gets left out of the conversation is U.S. companies, and I had firsthand exposure to that, compete with Chinese companies around the world, particularly in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Europe, and so forth. And often we were outflanked because of the massive amount of Chinese financing to support their exports globally. So, frequently the discussion with China has to do with the Chinese market and the American market. But I think left out of that conversation, as I said, is the rest of the world where we compete toe to toe with the Chinese frequently. I think the other thing, Aubrey, that if you look at growth rates over the last decade or two, 80% of the global growth is China and the U.S. And I think that's what's made this trade war so dangerous, because it's, mom and dad are fighting and it's not good for the family. And that's the best analogy I can think of right now. Now, and you did mention, I'll be brief, the U.S. Export-Import Bank, for those who are watching today, was founded in 1934 and provides loans and guarantees to support U.S. export, to support U.S. jobs. And there are now about over 100 export-import banks around the world. Our bank was basically shuttered for 5 months over disagreements with Congress. It is now back on track, somewhat weakened, frankly, by the current legislation, but it's got a 7-year term, so that puts it in a good place. And going forward, as we come out of this COVID crisis, we're going to have to put a lot more Americans back to work, and exports are a key driver of employment. So I'm optimistic from that point of view.
For sure. And what you've seen in this era of U.S.-Chinese global competition, if you will, a reinvigoration of U.S. institutions that support U.S. companies because of that exact issue that you brought up, Fred. And you see that with the transformation of OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, into the Development Finance Corporation with a bigger budget, with more powers. And so you're really seeing an amplification of American commercial policy during this period. I want to turn to Congressman Hill and to see, a lot of this concern around Chinese practices globally in the trade realm has come bipartisan, and it's come from American members of Congress in particular. And so I'd love to get your view on U.S.-China trade and where it is today and what you can see going forward.
Well, good morning and good evening to everybody, and always terrific to be at a Concordia event. Nick, thank you, and Matthew for creating this forum for people around the world to talk through issues particularly important to all of our citizens and our economy, and we're always grateful for a chance to do it. Regretfully, it's not in person, and yet it is another meeting by Zoom, but thanks for the opportunity. And Fred, great to see you. I will extend your best regards to Larry Walther, who is working hard, as you always know, now as the Chief Financial Officer at the state of Arkansas. So thanks for saying hi. Well, this is an important topic, and let me start out by saying that, the United States is an old friend to China. We were there for China in the 1830s. We were there for China in the 1890s and 1900 to help support the open door policy for China when others in the world would not. We were there in 1907 to create the first U.S. China Education Opportunity Fund by returning our reparations in the Boxer Rebellion for educating Chinese students in the United States. And of course, we were there for China as a partner to defeat the fascists in Japan during the end of the 1930s and World War II. So we are an old friend to China, and we love the Chinese people. And Dr. Wang's report of the benefits since 1979 of China's opening up and the renewed diplomatic relations with the United States and the economic progress since World War II internationally are all 100% right. I agree with all of that. What's, I think, changed in recent years, I like the mom and dad analogy, but I think it's more complicated than that. As China's economic success has grown into the large economy. It's now the world's largest creditor in the world. The Chinese Communist Party has taken a pivot and is specifically not interested per se in integration in the global economy and not particularly interested in the family of nations by playing by the rules. And this is what I think has frustrated not only policymakers in Washington, but policymakers in London and other capitals around the world, including in North Asia. And so let's be clear that I think the trade challenges that we have are a derivative issue of the Chinese Communist Party's change in its financial economic strategy, its diplomatic strategy, and its military strategy, both in the North Asia and South Asia regions, as well as around the world. And there are many examples of that. But let me say, I think that's really one of the driving strategic forces here that Dr. Wang referenced Graham Allison's research. I think there was a concrete, specific decision taken in Beijing to do this, and I think that has unbalanced that integration and growing relationship between China as an economy and China as a strategic military rival in the world. And so that's sort of my operating philosophy here. We can talk, we're talking about trade today, but I just wanted to open it up with that
Sure.
Sort of theoretical view first. Thanks.
Yeah, and you really brought up the structural challenges. I want to talk a little bit about the risks that those bring and the perceived versus the real risks. And so Michelle and Nick, I'd love your perspectives. You've been both very involved in the communication of geopolitical risks and convening. And so Michelle, give your thoughts as to how the markets are perceiving these risks. We've seen markets rally in times we haven't expected it. And so is there something that we're not seeing and not understanding in the dialogue?
Thanks, Aubrey. I'd say to your point about whether these are real or exaggerated risks, from a business perspective, and where Weber Shandwick is advising clients on their communication strategy, There's a huge impact on business. And if you look at relations between US and China and how businesses have to navigate that, it matters economically, it matters politically, it matters from a national security perspective. And so companies, multinational companies in particular, navigating all of those forces, in addition to COVID, makes it extremely risky when it comes to their reputation. And so you have day-to-day decision-making now from companies such as, how do I not end up on an entities list in the US or in China? How do I not say or do anything if I can control that at all? How do I find ways to drive growth? How do I find ways to simply continue doing business in both markets? And for many companies, the US and China are their two largest markets. As Dr. Wang said earlier, there's $700 billion in US company assets in China, $500 billion of sales annually. So when you have a conversation about banning WeChat, for example, that's why you see a lot of American companies coming forth and expressing concern about that, because it impacts their ability to communicate with consumers in China, in addition to other things. And then finally, they're asking how they deliver on ESG, and the importance of ESG, environmental sustainability and governance, has remained top of mind even through the COVID pandemic. But how do they continue to do that across borders and across cultures, when sometimes the ability to do that and to drive corporate values consistently in different parts of the world is somewhat impossible or creates conflict? And so from our perspective, and where we're advising global brands, I'd say there's three areas from a reputation standpoint that they've got to keep top of mind. First and foremost is employees. So if you're a multinational with employees both in the US, in China, in Europe, how are you making sure that amid all this dialogue happening between nations, your employees remain unified and that they don't have to pick sides, but they're focused on the business mission? From an external point of view, how are companies now engaging in public diplomacy so that they are engaging stakeholders, whether it's foreign governments, employees, consumers, suppliers, and partners, because of the changes happening in supply chain? How are they engaging them when values and brand ideals may not resonate the same across borders and cultures anymore? And I'd say the importance of data and the ability to do that and understand attitudes and perceptions in different parts of the world is more important than ever. And certainly a lot of risk, but a lot of opportunity using the right data and insights, being culturally mindful can help bolster reputation.
No doubt, it's a complex operational environment. One would say that many would just sit back and try to wait it out, or to find refuge in their home market. I mean, Nick, you've brought so many amazing people together through Concordia and your work at Concordia. I mean, what are you seeing in terms of trends where people are looking to stay at home or continue to find the right way to go invest and do business abroad?
Thank you, Aubrey. Thank you for doing this for us. It's really an honor to be here, and thank you all on behalf of Concordia for joining us. As well as my role at Concordia, I also serve as the vice chairman of our family business, which is involved in pretty much all things trade. Being Greek, we're shipping. We have about a fleet of nearly 100 container ships, and what I would say, and air freight and all the, what I would say is trade continues, right? I mean, if you look at actually what has happened since COVID, container shipping, which moves about 90% of manufactured goods, everything from tables to computers to anything that's manufactured, at some point it was in a container somewhere on the ocean, right? And the rest moves by air freight. The container shipping market has just really taken off since the COVID crisis, and it was very unexpected, and people thought the air freight market would, but I think, obviously people are ordering more things, and so people need groceries, people need goods, and that all comes via ships. And so, people are very concerned about what will happen in the future between the US and China. We're big customers of Chinese shipyards, and so we have many different business relationships in China. We're based in the US, and so it's a complicated relationship for our business to navigate. And obviously we're watching it very carefully, as many businesses are, and that's why you see the market the stock market before COVID and to some extent after COVID so sensitive to any Chinese-US deal or no deal. But as of now, I mean, we don't see any sort of reduction in trade. We don't see any desire for a reduction. It just, it's just people can't go out, and so they need more things delivered to them. So, we are hopeful
and that to recognize that we might have to wait longer for those things. And so I know that shipping is catching up and transport's catching up, but I think everyone's prepared to wait a little longer for their goods, and that's probably benefited shipping companies that have tried to get online and scale to the need. Yes,
for sure. And I mean, it seems like every day I'm reading that Amazon is hiring 100,000 people, literally like every week. I mean, there are a lot of people out there, my wife being one of them, who aren't comfortable going to a grocery store, for instance, right? And so that's something that you would go out and pick up now is being delivered to you, and that has an impact on the global supply chain at all different levels, starting with the producers, ending with the last mile delivery. So trade disruptions have not only been concentrated in the U.S. China relationship over the last few years. Many of us have been following very closely the Brexit challenges and what it means for Europe and global trade. And I really want to dive in and to kind of blend that with our conversation in terms of the market overall. And so first I'll turn to Ambassador Reiter. If you can give your thoughts, you are very involved in not only in your current role, but also prior when you were involved in EU policy on these topics. So, where are we with conversation around trade and Brexit, and what's the view from Europe when thinking about the overall trade market?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Aubrey. By the way, I was fascinated by this discussion. In my current role in Vodafone, I spent the last 18 months in shuttle diplomacy to Washington, trying to figure out how to navigate the collapse of security with trade and with technology. I mean, in the past, historically, there's always been firewalls between these policy areas. And I think one of the reasons that we're all struggling in the corporate sector is that the well-established firewalls have come down. So suddenly we can't deal with tech issues separately from security issues, or even separately from trade issues. And that's an excruciatingly difficult issue to manage. Luckily, and this is my underlying point on Brexit has nothing to do with that. It's not a geopolitical conflict between Europe and the UK. It is a reflection of a different trend that is also going on around the world, which is national self-determination, where a number of countries are expressing hope to unshackle themselves from international arrangements that they may or may not have entered into that are varying degrees very deep. Just to be very clear, Brexit is, in the sense of EU integration, it's not like a trade deal. It's basically deep integration, which means that you have the same rules and everything. So it's not like you're unwinding a trade deal. You're unwinding, it's rather than unwinding a marriage, you're unwinding a DNA chromosome in the sense of how to move the different things apart. And that's why the corporate sector has been very concerned on the manner in which that is being done. And that is something that is still being expressed quite strongly by the corporate sector. I don't think you have a lot of discussions actually on whether it's going to happen. It's more a question, how is it going to happen? And how do we make sure that we minimize what is otherwise a supply chain and supply side shock to the UK economy, as well as to the European economy, at the point where we really don't want to have it already with a significant drop in economic activity post-COVID. So you will hear from the corporate sector. In the case of me working in the UK, I engage heavily with the UK government. How do we manage this from the point of view of the cost of doing business will go up for anything that is import or export related or supply chain related. And I work in a services company, but we have had to build warehouses. We have to factor in time of delays of deployment of network equipment as we roll out networks, for example, or the introduction of the new Apple phone that I'm sure a lot of British and European customers look forward to, the new 5G Apple phone. But these are the things you need to build in. There's a separate thing which is less discussed, but I know Tony is very familiar with, and he's driving it brilliantly in the discussion with the United States, is around data, where actually the UK has a very open mindset on data. And it's more the problem that as there is the departure of the UK from the European Union fully after withdrawal agreement, what will be the arrangements for data between the two jurisdictions, but actually Europe and the rest of the world. And I would like to throw that in there because I don't think in the discussion between the marriage of China and in the United States, not a lot of people have paid attention to what happened in July, which will bring a huge question mark around what's the future of global supply chains when you actually cannot transfer data to high-risk jurisdictions, so-called high-risk jurisdictions, of which the UK and the United States may very well be two that the EU determines to be high risk. Final thing is on international standards, right? So there is a lot of excitement around how you disentangle two jurisdictions like this in the case of UK's exit. The real concern for corporates is not about the tariffs. It's annoying with the additional customs clearance, and it takes a long time, and whether there will be port facilities enough in the UK. The real problem is around whether we are faced with duplicative standards, duplicative technical regulations, duplicative certification procedures. That's the thing that really disentangle economies. And this is where, unfortunately, the rhetoric around unshackling from EU regulation can work directly against the UK's interest, because for many of the EU regulations that we as corporates like to comply with, is not because we like them because they're EU regulations, because they're based on international standards. It has nothing to do with the EU. And this is where we have, as a corporate sector, we're engaging heavily with the UK government to ensure that we don't start deviating from international standard, because the UK's economy size is just not big enough to have dedicated assembly lines just for the UK. And I'm here making an exception for maybe plugs in the wall and where you keep your the steering wheel in your car, because that's already a unique UK standard.
In the metric system. But yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. I want to turn to Commissioner Phillipson. I think what you've kind of outlined is a three-part world when it comes to data and standards, when it comes to how we think about even privacy and the internet. And I work a lot in African markets, and the question has been, how is Africa going to fit in that? Which standards are they going to go with? Are they going to go with the European model, if you will? And so, Commissioner, we'd love to hear your thoughts, not only on any way that Brexit could impact trade, but you're there to kind of manage the special relationship between the US and the UK. And what you think about Ambassador Reiter's point about data and the questions about movement of data.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and it's a real pleasure to be part of this panel. And as others have said, I just wish we could have been doing it in person. This is always a huge week here in New York, and the Concordia events are always a highlight. I mean, I think there's a number of issues we could unpack here. I mean, I think I would just make two very quickly, if I may. First of all, Brexit, which is done. We did Brexit on the 31st of January this year when the UK left the EU. This is now about the UK forging its new partnerships, not only with the EU, but also taking the opportunity to forge new partnerships with the US. We've just wrapped up the fourth round of the free trade agreement negotiations. We're talking about financial services, regulatory alignment, and a working group that we've set up on that. We reached a milestone with Japan a few weeks ago. We're pursuing trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand, and even looking to join the CPTPP. So, this is an opportunity for us to forge new relationships in a number of directions at the same time. On data and digital, I think that point is absolutely crucial, and I think it's illustrative of a number of areas where we need to address the questions about the future standards and frameworks around the future of the global economy. I think I would certainly agree that digital trade, data flows are almost sort of the 21st century version of oil 110 years ago. And we need to get those frameworks right, but they're not the only issue that we should be discussing. And I think that takes us to a general point about the overall global governance that we need to be part of. And if I can just go back to the previous question about U.S. China, it's called not just a binary or bilateral issue. We're all heavily affected by what happens between the U.S. and China. And my foreign secretary was talking in a panel in Washington last week, talking about the need to form coalitions of like-minded that, of course, include China in many issues. If we're going to talk about climate, you can't talk about that without China. So I think, the Brexit process, which will continue to play out in terms of our future relationship with the EU, is not about the UK turning in on itself or turning away from the world. It's about giving us the opportunity to form those new relationships, those new coalitions across this whole set of issues.
And Commissioner, I want to dig into that a little bit because, here in Washington and when the Trump administration took over, there was an articulated clear preference for bilateral trade agreements. In the Africa space where I work, the discussion that AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which was a kind of a broad approach, will be replaced with a series of direct free trade agreements. And we're doing that with Kenya now. You're talking about negotiating a bunch of free trade agreements that are bilateral in nature. How do you see the tension of working with kind of an underpinning bilateral trade system, but then having multilateral cooperation? How does the UK think about navigating that?
Well, I think my answer would be that we need to be pragmatic. We need to reach agreements and form new frameworks and standard-setting dialogues wherever we need them. And I think we will continue to push forward at a bilateral level, but we also want to push forward on a plurilateral level. For example, one key issue for us is reaching an agreement within the OECD on a digital services tax, so that we don't have to do anything bilaterally, nor do others. But we also care deeply about the multilateral system, which is why we're running a candidate for DG of the WTO. We think the WTO needs to be reformed. It needs to re-establish its ability to form rules, and we need to fix the issues around dispute settlement. So I think it's that mix of issues. Now, I know that sometimes we can get a bit worried that we end up with a sort of plethora of bilateral agreements that makes it difficult for companies to navigate, and we can get into all the fun stuff around rules of origin and especially as Joakim said, around the issues of sort of competing standards. But I think it's inevitable that it's not going to be a neat, simple, one agreement governs all. It will be a mix of bilateral, plurilateral, multilateral. Actually, I would also just observe quickly here in the US, one thing that we are spending a lot of time doing, as well as the FTA negotiation between the two governments, is trying to engage at state level, because quite a lot of the issues, especially around standards that we would like to address, are a matter of state competence, if you want to look at mutual recognition of professional qualifications. So we're going sort of subnational, national, plurilateral, multilateral. It sounds quite complicated, but I think we're out there looking to just realize and exploit those opportunities where we can.
Well, we're really lucky to have a congressman on this panel that can talk about exactly those concerns from a more local level in the United States. Congressman.
I just want to jump in on this data point that Ambassador mentioned and the Commissioner mentioned, because it's so important. In the U.S., it frustrates many of our international friends because of our federal government and our 50-state regulatory and legal framework. It means that we move slower on a lot of topics, and data is one of those. It's so important, and we've referenced the national security aspect of data today, but I want to talk about the consumer aspect of data too. The Europeans' move to a data privacy standard has been very helpful here in the United States to try to galvanize this conversation and try to determine one statute on data privacy and, as was noted, data ownership, both in financial services and healthcare, two of our largest portions of our GDP here. Two different areas, obviously, but where data privacy is essential, cyber protections are essential, personal authentication is essential. And so those elements are the foundation if we ever want to move to a full digital economy that's based on a blockchain or uses any kind of an electronic payment for consumers, particularly in the cryptocurrency arena. So we're trying to move and find consensus on that. We want to thank our European friends for moving on data ownership and data privacy. Appreciate the UK's leadership there. And just know that we know that's a big challenge. And we've now referenced it and updated, obviously, in the North American Free Trade Arrangement, the USMCA. Canada, Mexico, and the US have agreed to digital standards and IP-related issues that didn't exist in the 1990s. And the origin of that language, a lot of it was in what we've used in the transatlantic negotiations and the trans-Pacific negotiations. So in trade, data is, as was noted, a new commodity of great importance.
You appreciate that, and this move to digital trade is very important because that same tension that the ambassador brought up about the localization or maintaining an autonomy in your own supply chains can apply to data as well, and data localization, so that we need to find the right way forward in all supply chains, including digital. So I'll turn back to Ambassador Reiter and really to talk about that topic and to respond.
Thanks to the congressman. I think this is really important. I was asked when I started the Vodafone what I felt about the GDPR, because at that point a number of representatives of the U.S. government was very much going after the Europeans for this being far too extensive and having de facto extraterritorial effect, which legally speaking it does to some extent. My point was this. I think that we in the Western world has been far too naive on the level of trust that is required by our citizens to be fully empowered citizens in a digital society. And that's true for both cybersecurity, by the way, which is an area where Europe, contrary to the United States, in my view, have been far too fragmented and invested far too little in its capabilities, UK excluded. And then on the privacy side, I do believe that we as Western democracies need to come together and have a common understanding on basic benchmark. The problem, however, just to highlight the implications of what's going on right now, is in the absence of a useful, non-conflictual discussion around it, countries are going for quick solutions, which are the data localization requirements. And they do not limit that, frankly, to people and personal data. They also include machine data. And I frankly don't know how you will run an earth-moving machine from Caterpillar in one of the mines in Africa if they can't send the data on the oil levels back to the headquarters as part of their R&D function sitting in the United States. So there is a real threat to the fabric of which we have built up our manufacturing, our trading system, by the growing demands for data localization that is creeping into machine to machine as part of the large technological change that we're moving from P2P communication to machine communication, which is the big sort of tech shift that is happening right now. And so I'm genuinely really worried, and I can just plead that both the European, UK, and the American representatives come together actually around the negotiating table and try to find some common ground on this, in the absence of which you will continue to have all these different regimes establishing their own standards. To give you a concrete example of how bad it can get. So we have been working with World Bank, IMF, UNICEF, European Union to try to use mobility insight data, anonymized and aggregated, to help countries flatten the curve during COVID. It was absolutely a disaster. We had to negotiate with every single privacy activist regulator across our footprint to be able to help governments combat an existential threat, if you want, for their society in the sense of COVID. And that's where we just need a reset, take a step back and say, you know what, it is right to ask for privacy. It's right to have anonymization, aggregation, so as to make sure that we don't compromise anyone's personal data. But we do need to set the framework so that we can still get the benefits that we are striving for from the point of view of the data economy and the way that is underpinning actually the competitiveness of our entire economy going forward. And that's the discussion I'm missing currently at the global level.
And Fred, do you want to jump in?
I think that I'm going to blame the companies for this. Frankly, the companies are fighting against data localization. You cannot go on any website without simply agreeing to share all your data. Consumers are totally in the dark. They have no idea what they've signed on to, and companies are perfectly content to do that. Because if you don't sign on, you essentially can't get on the website. So I think companies have a long way to go to explain why this is important, because if they don't get voters and consumers on their side, this becomes sort of an elite, large corporate argument that I think will actually fall flat. So I really do blame companies. There's no explanation why we need the data, or few have said, okay, you can sort of share some of your data, but not all your data. But until they start to do that,
and I guess the question is, do we actually need a fully functioning market for data, right? We already know, and you know, someone made the analogy that it's like the oil, right? But if I find oil in my backyard, I get to sell it, right? I don't know how much my personal data is worth every day that I'm giving away, and I'm not getting paid for it in any way, right? Yes, I'm getting better recommendations from Netflix. I'm getting, you know, recommendations on the podcasts I like. So yes, I'm benefiting to some extent of data processing, but I'm not necessarily getting paid for it. And that global market for data needs to evolve to some extent in order to get where Fred is talking about, where consumers are full participants in it.
But could I just say, it's not that I don't think I fundamentally disagree. I think it's a really, really valid point. However, let's not make Caterpillar the collateral damage of the actions of Facebook, because that's basically where you're going at, right? We're talking about fundamentally different companies with fundamentally different models. As a telco, I'm locally licensed. I am ruthlessly scrutinized on the confidentiality of data of my customers on a daily basis. That's not true for Google. Google could do, for example, the COVID analysis or how people moved in the UK, while I was still negotiating with the DPA of the United Kingdom on whether I was allowed to even crunch the data and hand it over to the government. So it's like we're on the one hand, we have a laissez-faire sort of impunity model for the over-the-top players, while we're ruthless in micromanaging other sectors. And I think that's where you need to draw the distinction a bit differently.
No, and I'm glad you brought that back to kind of real economy, things we can touch and feel, supply chains, because what's certainly happening during COVID is an effort by many countries to reshore critical supply chains. And we're seeing that not only in the US with conversations around what are strategic supply chains and value chains we need to have here, but we've also seen it in Europe. The French have called for it, UK, also Japan. Japan's putting a ton of money. Central Bank of Japan has billions aside for bringing supply chains back. There's an agreement between Japan, Australia, and India to look at diversification of supply chains away from China. So I want to bring Michelle into this topic because the reshoring of supply chains on one level could be seen as just a kind of political conversation happening. On another level, the question is, how real is it and how possible is it when in certain supply chains, China dominates, like, for example, 80% of the graphite, the world that goes into lithium batteries is processed in China. You have huge domination of particular processing in supply chains. Are we going to see a realignment in supply chains, or is it a lot of political conversation at this point? Michelle?
I think the conversation has been going on for a long time. Even before COVID. And so I think the pandemic has accelerated that conversation. The current state of relations between the US and China has accelerated that conversation. But it's not new. And if you look at, and to Joakim's point earlier, there's this notion of self-determination that's not only a priority on the part of governments and policymakers, but companies recognize that too. They've got to have a diversified supply chain in order to, first and foremost, just get their products to their customers. And if you look at Sanofi in France, for example, they announced in February a company to create their own active chemical ingredients for drugs because there's too much reliance in their perspective on China and India. And if you're going to do it, I think their CEO said you've got to make sure you're doing it right. And so I think you see companies also looking at how they can take control of their own self-determination, strategic autonomy, to use language from Europe. The challenge is, however, in this type of geopolitical environment, in this type of technology environment where you have consumers and employees empowered with technology to be able to raise issues, speak up and stand out, there's a lot of political and there's a lot of public attention, even on an issue as seemingly benign as supply chains. And so from a reputation communications perspective, companies have to start paying attention to the political attention they're going to earn if they start diversifying supply chains. So if you're a company and you're in the US and in China and you start shifting some of your production out of China, what sort of attention does that earn you negatively from China? If you don't do that, and maybe Congressman Hill could speak to this, you could see a number of members of Congress perhaps calling CEOs up to testify about why they're relying so much on China and not making sure that, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, there's enough diversity to ensure that the United States and their companies are getting the right medical supplies and pharmaceutical ingredients. So companies are getting caught in the crosshairs, but I'd say supply chains is certainly an immediate issue, top of mind, but it's going to be a long-term change. If it were easy to change, it would have happened already. But I think companies certainly have to pay attention not only to their supply chain strategy, but how they're communicating around it, given the attention. For example, you have Prime Minister Modi in India. He wrote a LinkedIn post about India and his vision for India as the new global nerve center. So even in India, earning a lot of attention. So certainly,
well, I think it is an opportunity for a lot of countries to figure out to get part of the trade that is been dominated by China, and we've seen some spin out to Vietnam and other places in the kind of near realm. But for example, African countries that are very involved in the mining of products that go into lithium batteries. Maybe there are partnerships between the U.S. or Europe that could be developed that are part of these new supply chains. I want to turn to Commissioner Phillipson to talk about.
Whoops, sorry.
Go ahead, Fred. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, quick thing. After 9/11, a lot, particularly in New York and around the world, financial service firms realized they need to have some duplicate data processing and IT capabilities because of the devastation from 9/11. So there'll be some duplication, some greater resilience and robustness on supply chain, but the reshoring feels very much to be right now a political response more than a need response. I mean, part of that would have been solved by simply having suitable inventory, which we did not have. So I think we just have to be careful as we navigate this, because on PPP it's easy, but on some more complicated products, the supply chains are much more complex.
Sure, and we saw that after the tsunami in Japan as well, discussions of a need for more resilience and robustness in supply chains so that a disruption doesn't affect everyone. I'll turn to Commissioner Phillipson and then Dr. Wang. I want to hear your views on supply chains and pressure in China.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think the first point I wanted to make was the one I think that Fred has just made around, it's not about necessarily just reshoring, bringing everything back. It's making sure that our supply chains in critical sectors are resilient. And I think really wanted to agree with Michelle's point that this was a discussion that was starting pre-COVID and has been really accelerated through COVID as we all sort of completely, searching desperately for PPE. It also, of course, in my view, actually reveals the fact that I don't personally see a world where China isn't going to be part of that. China was a massive contributor of PPE in a whole host of countries in terms of dealing with the initial COVID response. But then the other point I just wanted to make is, from a UK perspective, this point about having a conversation about open trade and not sort of resorting to protectionism. We've seen that play out in the G20. The trade ministers are actually meeting today where they'll be talking about this again. The UK really pushing for open trade and free trade, essentially, in key pharmaceutical products. And of course, we're beginning to see the beginning of the discussion about, hopefully one day soon, when there is a vaccine, how do we make sure that there is equitable, fair access to all around the world for that vaccine, because the virus doesn't respect borders. We can't fix it in just one country. And the UK will have the chairmanship of the G7 next year, taking over from the US. And I think this theme of economic resilience and then unpacking it into these various component pieces is going to be a really big part of that agenda. And it goes back to the point we've made. I think we can't do this alone. We have to do it in partnership with others through the various groups that we are members of. Thank you.
And Dr. Wang, as I've said, so many countries around the world are working to push supply chains out of China. What's been the reaction in China to this effort, and how are the Chinese decision makers and policy makers thinking about supply chain?
I think this is really a little bit surprise, of course, to China as well, because as we all know, this goes back to David Ricardo's comparative advantage. Whoever does the best, let's do it, because otherwise we're dividing into different duplicates and redundant, and let's lower the efficiency of the mankind. So I think that it's really unfortunate we see this trend is going very strong now. I mean, everybody wants to decouple, everybody wants to do things on its own, which is really not really globalization. It's not the meaning of that. So I think maybe countries should really do what they are doing best. I mean, like U.S. doing well on high tech, on airplane, on iPhone, whatever. China buying a lot of that. So whatever China is doing better, maybe labor a bit more tech intensive. Now China actually also digital economy is coming up very fast now, counting about 36% of China GDP now. And I agree with what Anthony was talking about. UK joined CPTPP. China is interested in that too. I mean, China's premier said at the National People's Congress news conference that China is interested in in looking at the CPTPP. So in that, we have a data flows, we have a new regulations. We need to really make a global consensus on those things. So I think that China has a huge data. I mean, we have TikTok not being banned or trying to sort it out, or WeChat is not going to use. If we see things like that, we're going back to really primitive days. So I think, whatever country still does the best, let's have a WTO. If a WTO doesn't work, let's have a CPTPP maybe as a model, and then to try to fix WTO with US and EU and the three G20 or G10, whatever, including China, that we could do that all together. Hopefully, I like the Fred those days of Exim Bank, helping US company doing business in China. I remember Fred was visiting my office a number of years ago. So I hope that the business is still the big trend to tie everybody together. The business common sense will prevail. Otherwise, having a trade war with China, having a decouple with China would really create a huge recession for the world. And we're even, going back to the very dark days of, worse devastating than bashing China. So if China is okay with its system, maybe we should give a little tolerance and just give a longer view, see how this goes, and use the international mechanism to really multilateralism to really working together rather than unilateralism. Everybody does its own now. It's very dangerous, I think. So China's view now, I think in general, I mean, particularly my think tank, we think we should really work together to solve the issues. Particularly US and China and the EU has the moral responsibility. If we are getting the number one, number two largest economy and the number three, we should really work together rather than we fight among ourselves. And COVID-19 has demonstrated. China has been so effective in containing. Now, there's no single case locally occurring in China for 1.4 billion people. I mean, let's talk about something that shows if China really determined to work, it can work well and very effective, very efficient. So we should really working with US and EU rather than we fight each other. It's really no point. I think there's a lot of things we can solve in the long run, rather than having a short every day wake up with always sanctions or there's always a news on China. So I hope that we can really maybe stabilize, I hope, after elections somehow, and not deteriorating like a downward spiral. And everybody, I know, we are really, everybody's not sure the future. All the companies are hanging on I don't know what's going on. And that's greatly damaging.
So I'm glad you brought up the elections. None of us are naive to what's going on in this election year in the United States and its impact on some of the topics we're speaking about today. So what I want to do, conscious of time, because we're getting near the end of our time together this morning, is to go around to each of you and ask what would be your advice on trade issues to a new government in the United States, whether it's a second Trump administration or it's a Biden administration. What would be your point of view and your key points you would want to stress to that? So Dr. Wang, I'll start with you and then we'll go all the way around.
Well, I really think that, there's some US politics involved, but I do hope that President Trump, if he wins the second term, I hope that he continue the phase 2, phase 3. Let's talk it. We should really engage in dialogue and talking. And then, probably he's a businessman. He has to listen to the business community. I'm surprised that his Twitter has really calmed down all the business voice. I mean, the businesses suffer. I mean, U.S. businesses suffer from the huge market from China. I mean, and also the world business suffer. So I hope that if he wins, then he will come back to the common sense and the phase 2, phase 3. Let's talk. Let's have a business together. And let's solve all the other issues together, too. If Biden wins, I think he will reassert his leadership on the Western Alliance, and he will talk to all the other alliance, and then he will go back to climate change, which needs China. He will go back to TPP, which China interested to join. He will go back to WHO. China is a big supporter of that. He will probably go back to WTO. China is like to help as well. So I hope that there will be more platform we can talk about. Rather than now, we don't see each other anymore. There's no face-to-face meetings. It's very dangerous if we continue like that. We need to talk and really have all those productive meetings. So either of them, I pin hopes that things will get better than now.
Yep.
And not going to be really continue to fight with each other.
So I'll turn to Fred. Fred, you're now asked for your advice for a new administration. What are your key points on trade? And you're on mute.
If Joe Biden is elected president, I think we're going to see a sea change. I think, as Dr. Wang mentioned, I think that there'll be a greater re-engagement with China. I think it's going to be firm. I think there is not that we were naive before, but I think in terms of giving China the benefit of the doubt, which I think it got from a number of administrations in an attempt to bring them in, is a little less so. I think there'll be greater engagement with allies in terms of finding where we can find common ground with China and where we need to be sort of firm in that regard. If Donald Trump is reelected, I think it's going to be rather bleak. I think that they are moving headlong into this wrong-headed idea of a Cold War. I think that's a bad analogy. I think that will not lead to a good outcome. And I'm actually quite pessimistic that things will not get better. They will only get worse.
Ambassador Reiter, what would you like to see in a new American administration when it comes to the issues you're passionate on and trade?
Well, my advice, perhaps naively, would be stop having tactical decisions, take strategic decisions. In the end, what we're dealing with in terms of the balance of rights and obligations between China and the United States in the future, the reshoring or not and the resilience of our society are strategic choices that are currently being addressed by policymakers as tactical decisions. And the implication of that is predominantly you're seeing outside the two players, it's all collateral damage. It's collateral damage in terms of the future of the digital economy in Europe because of the Huawei dispute. It is collateral damage in Africa because of if you drive reshoring of supply chains from a protectionist point of view, as opposed to, and you add technology with automation, you're going to have a huge demographic challenge in Africa that is going to drive unemployment, increase the migration flows. So there needs to be a strategic lens on things as opposed to tactical whack-a-mole approach.
Yes, and I'll turn to Congressman Hill. We've talked already, we're a messy federal democracy. Sometimes that doesn't bode well for strategic planning and strategic thinking. But what's your views and recommendation to a administration? And, you sit in a different place, so you can hold them accountable as well.
Well, with our British friend on the call, the Americans will do the right thing after they've tried everything else, to paraphrase Prime Minister Churchill. First, let me say that the Biden administration will not go back to PPP. It was the Democrats that blocked TPP. Mrs. Clinton was opposed to it. Mrs. Pelosi was opposed to it. Bernie Sanders opposed to it. So I wouldn't anticipate the TPP popping up in Q1 of a Biden administration. Secondly, the WTO reform, I think, is a priority for the new administration of either party. President Trump's rhetoric about WTO has been loud, like all of his rhetoric on most topics, but really the United States is committed to reform in the WTO. As it relates to the relations with China, I think I would advise both administrations to, now that as I outlined in my earlier remarks, the diplomatic, military, trade, economic, and global credit conditions really affect all of the non-China countries. So I would recommend that the new administration collaborate with Prime Minister Johnson's idea on the D10, and that we have a multilateral approach to encouraging the Chinese Communist Party to play by the rules in the WTO, the World Bank, the Paris Club, the ocean free transport in the oceans in the South China Sea, etc. And let's not assume everything is bleak, to paraphrase my friend Fred. President Trump has a good respect for President Xi in China, and they've collaborated, as you know, on North Korea, for example. You don't see very many 15-0 National Security Council votes at the UN, and that was achieved by China and the United States cooperating. So I would just conclude by saying, well, I see a lot of economic and military tension. I think the democracies in the world have to work together to urge our leaders at the CCP and Beijing to play by the global rules. But we also have to find new ways to collaborate and work with China on issues of mutual concern, and I know that we will. So thanks for doing this, and proud to be with everybody today.
Commissioner, what would you like to see in the next administration when it comes to trade issues?
I'll be very quick to make sure that Michelle and Nick can get in as well. I would endorse everything the Congressman has just said, that notion of identifying the big challenges, working with partners and allies to address them, reforming the institutions that we need to restore that sense of governance in these issues. I would add only one thing, which is let's finish off what would be the biggest FTA that the US has ever done with a single country, between the first and fifth biggest economies in the world, and use that as the basis for taking our relationship to the next level for the next few decades. Thank
Michelle?
you.
I would say it's always important to remember that a government's first duty is to its people. And this president has been clear about emphasizing that he does want a constructive relationship with China, but that can't come at the expense of the American people. And one of his foundational principles has been fairness and reciprocity. And Europe has also emphasized reciprocity. And so when it comes to trade, that means it's got to benefit the American people, American businesses, American consumers. And what businesses have been asking for is transparency, intellectual property rights and protection of those, a level playing field. And so I'd say all of those policies, which are based on fairness and reciprocity, no matter who the president is, should continue in order to advance what the American people are asking for. And let's not forget, it's not just the administration, but as you noted from the very beginning, there's a lot of bipartisan consensus on the Hill and amid Congress about what these policies need to reflect. And again, that's a reflection of the American people and businesses. So their policies should always reflect what the people want.
Yeah, I think what the people want is a challenging thing in this election, given some of the divisions, and I hope that we do have some kind of consensus around that. And Nick, last but not least, because of your chairmanship of Concordia, I want to finish with you and your dependence on shipping and global trade for business. You know, what would you like to see a future U.S. administration focus on when it comes to these very important issues?
Thank you. I'll be very, very quick. Listen, I think for everything we've discussed today, from data to trade to, reshoring, onshoring, what happens in the election here will be fundamentally, have a fundamental impact on how each of those go. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are about as different as can be, both personally and professionally. It's the elephant in the room, and the United States still, and I'm a recent proud U.S. citizen, so I can say this is the leader of the world, still to people's, as much as some people don't like to think of it that way. And so, if Biden wins, you go back to 2016, 2015, the way it was. If Trump wins, which I think is very possible, you continue on the past 4 years, where you've seen pretty much every norm, as they say, broken, which some people very much like, others don't. So we're in limbo until that point on many fronts, and we'll see how it goes.
And that limbo may linger. The solution may not be in early November if we have a very close election. So I think a lot of the world will be watching, and especially on these important issues of trade. I want to thank my esteemed panel. It's been my honor to have this conversation with you this morning and evening, Dr. Wang. So really, we didn't settle the issues. It was never going to be settled in an hour, and I hope everyone continues to enjoy the Concordia conference and the discussions being had, because these are the issues that are shaping our times. So thank you, everyone.